policing in this country is done in proportion to how much potential unrest your community is going to cause. There is accommodation to some groups and very firm repression to others. Labour councils were telling schools, you must not ask pupils to draw images of Jesus because that would be blasphemous to Muslim pupils. The snobbery that's directed towards the white working class, who do actually have to live with the consequences of what the middle and upper middle class vote for. There is this unique power that masses of people possess. There's serious fear about rising civil disorder.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and I'm delighted to be joined by Ben Jones.
Hi Fraser, thanks very much.
Ben, people may know you as the Director of Case Management at the Free Speech Union, and you've also written a brilliant new book called Island of Strangers. I want to start by talking about the title because people will be familiar with that as a speech taken from a speech by Keir Starmer, where he's warning that we could be sliding into a kind of society that's falling apart, that's coming apart at the seams. It's a speech about immigration. He obviously regretted giving that speech, and he was thinking about this as a future kind of dystopia. But I think your argument is that we're already an island of strangers. Is that right? That's the kind of context for this book.
That's it. It's not only that he regretted giving the speech, I'm not sure he knew what he was doing as he was delivering the speech. He seemed not to have even read it, and he stood up at the lectern and started reading. It seemed afterwards to have been surprised by what he was saying, to have not read it beforehand or even thought about it. So the most controversial thing I'm going to say is that Keir Starmer was right, but only about this one point.
It was probably the most perceptive thing he's ever said, and the only turn of phrase he'll be really remembered for. The basic argument of the book, I think it's fair to summarise it as that, Britain has become more diverse, we have mass immigration, and this has put pressure on freedom of speech. Can you explain how that might work?
The most basic premise of the book is that diversity has consequences. Some people think those consequences are universally good. Some people think they're universally bad. Most people are somewhere in the middle and see that there's good and bad. Just as different groups of migrants produce different economic outcomes, and incredibly, that's still a controversial thing to say, but the evidence is very clear. And just as different migrant groups produce different criminal activity, again, that remains controversial to say, but is undoubtedly true. My argument is that different groups will produce different consequences for freedom of speech, and that if we want to preserve our tradition of freedom of speech, which was hard won, which took centuries to emerge in this country, we need to be much more critical about migration, about multiculturalism, and about how multiculturalism is managed, because I think there are serious trade-offs which politicians have ignored for decades.
And what are some of those consequences in terms of freedom of speech? I mean, for instance, you could think about hate speech laws, things like that. Are those the main examples you have in mind?
Yes, in general terms, when you're governing a highly diverse and, I'm afraid, increasingly fragmented society, states will rely on hate speech laws. They will resort to two-tier policing in order to maintain the peace. The most difficult part of this problem, to be completely clear, is Islam and its demands for blasphemy laws. That isn't the only issue with respect to freedom of speech. But when you look at the polling of British Muslim views towards free speech, overwhelmingly the majority think that criticising Islam should be a criminal offence. And there's a substantial minority of British Muslims who believe that violence against people who depict Muhammad is justified. And so my argument is, in a way, blindingly obvious that if you're going to preserve a tradition of free speech in this country, there are some really serious problems when you have people from a civilization who understandably cling to the cultural values that they have embraced for centuries, and who come to the West, like elements of it, but are not persuaded by the rather unusual idea that people should be free to burn their holy book or to depict their prophet. And of course, in a sense, those Muslims who think that should be prohibited can't really be blamed for thinking it. I think most human beings who've ever lived would find freedom of speech a very strange and unsettling concept. It is something that is not universal. It is something that is very specific to particular cultures and places, and it's a virtue that we have discovered over millennia. It's not something we can take for granted.
And sticking with Islam, for instance, clearly it's one thing that Muslims feel strongly and passionately a certain way, that you shouldn't be able to mock their faith. Why does the British state take the same view as that? Why, we do effectively have an Islamic blasphemy law in Britain, both just in terms of the criminal law and in terms of people losing their jobs potentially, or facing social consequences for expressing criticism of Islam. Why do we have that situation? Surely it would be, you would expect the British government to say, well, no, we don't do that. We have freedom of speech. We have toleration for different religion and different groups. I'm sorry, but we're not going to arrest people for you.
In the book, I talk about 3 examples of Quran burning cases. I mean, of course, this is the single most provocative speech or protest act that I think really could be undertaken in modern Britain. And for the record, I don't approve of people burning books. And in a European context, it's obviously something that has some quite sinister associations. But nonetheless, it is a legitimate form of political protest for somebody to burn their own copy of a book. In those cases, the British state, or as I argue in the book, the UK state, was utterly demented in its persecution of those 3 men, 2 of whom were refugees who came to Britain explicitly seeking values of democracy, tolerance, freedom of and from religion, only to find that they were being questioned, arrested, prosecuted for burning the Koran. In the case of Hamit Koskan, who was or is a Turkish Armenian refugee who came to Britain, the Crown Prosecution Service, not only did they prosecute him, when he overturned that on appeal, they appealed against the appeal, and they put out this hysterical sounding press release calling what he'd done an act of desecration. And that sounded like wording that you would find from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
Yeah.
It was just this incredibly overwrought, hysterical denunciation of what he'd done. And there is this immense panic, I think, from the authorities about the danger of serious unrest. And we see this with the Batley Grammar School affair, where a teacher had to go into hiding with his family, who's still in hiding now, 5 years later. And also with incidents like the Wakefield Koran Gate affair, where, as you'll recall, some schoolboys lightly scuffed their own copy of the Koran in a sort of trivial incident at school. And this triggered this appalling scene of a sort of blasphemy show trial in a mosque, where you had various community leaders, in inverted commas, and I think the head teacher and various policemen and so on, and the mother of one of these boys. And I describe this in the book, where you can see that on paper it is the civic authorities that hold the power there. In practice, in a society which has become an island of strangers, where the emphasis is on suppressing unrest, it is the community leaders in that room who have the power to either call for calm or to call for unrest. And I quote in the book some of the comments made in that mosque at that community meeting, where people are saying that protecting the Quran is more important than our lives. And so it is against that level of passion that the British state is making its judgments about, well, all right, we'll suppress freedom of speech with these things. And if I may just make one final point on this theme. Most people don't burn Qurans. Most people don't have any interest in doing so. Most people don't intend to ever draw pictures of Muhammad. So you might say, well, on pragmatic grounds, let's just say Britain has changed, it's more multicultural, those activities are offensive for a certain community, so we're going to ask people not to do it and we're going to prosecute you if you do so. And some people might say, well, all right, that's a reasonable trade-off. The trouble is that once you embark upon that course of accommodation, once you sacrifice the principle of freedom of speech, you get situations like the one in Northern England a few months ago, where Labour councils were telling schools, you must not ask pupils to draw images of Jesus because that would be blasphemous to Muslim pupils because Jesus is a prophet in Islam. So once you embark upon this course, there's no turning back from it.
And it seems inevitably that different groups will end up being treated differently. I mean, this is part of the complaint to do with two-tier policing. I mean, certain minority groups feel that they are not getting the same shake of the whip as others as well. What do you make of that development?
I quote Edmund Burke, the conservative philosopher, in the book, and he uses this phrase, equality of restraint, and he describes how equality of restraint is a precondition for a liberal democratic society and for justice. And I think what we're now seeing with the debate around two-tier policing is the end of that equality of restraint. Different groups of people are treated in different ways. And in the book, I go through several pages of examples where I believe that that is the case. And it seems to me that policing in this country is done in proportion to how much potential unrest your community is going to cause. And that there is accommodation to some groups and very firm repression to others. You get strange paradoxes, for example, where the Metropolitan Police, you'll remember, I think it was last year, there were a group of Islamist protesters chanting for jihad. And the Metropolitan Police suddenly decided, no, actually, we're free speech absolutists, and this is not an incitement for violence. And we have experts in the control room who know what jihad really means. So don't you worry about it, please, British public. There's nothing to be concerned about here. And these are the paradoxes and the absurdities I point to in Island of Strangers, which I think are growing and compounding.
Is there a worry that people will see, say, for instance, the censorship that is being done on behalf of Muslim groups, and then they will ask for the same thing for their group, and that we end up with a tit-for-tat form of censorship where no one is free to speak or speak ill of any other to wade into any controversial issue, essentially?
I think that's right. One of the other arguments I make is that I completely accept there's not really a golden age of uninhibited free speech in Britain to go back to. There are periods where it's greater. There are periods where it's more constricted. But in a cohesive society, I mean, if we go back to Britain of the 1950s, which is now a phrase you only ever hear in a pejorative sense, but if we go back to that time, your plays will be censored by the government. Somebody in a ministry is going to read them before they can be performed. Blasphemy laws are on the books. They remain in effect, of course, until 2008, even if they're not really used. And well into the 1970s, I think in 1978, if I remember correctly, Mary Whitehouse attempted to bring a private prosecution or brought a private prosecution for blasphemy. So there are all sorts of things you can't say and that you'll get in trouble for saying. It's not a golden age of freedom of speech. But it has one advantage compared to the society of societies that we now have in an island of strangers, which is that you know what you can't say. In our society now, where you have so many identity groups, and I don't just mean migrant groups or their descendants, I mean the trans rights movement or Black Lives Matter, all of these groups where people have sublimated religion into politics. All of these groups have certain sets of sacred ideas which they then take to their workplace, or they pressure the state or the public sector or the private sector to impose. And so instead of one set of ideas you can't blaspheme against, we have lots of ideas that you can't blaspheme against. If you're too pro-Israeli, you will get in trouble. If you are a feminist with gender critical views, you will get in trouble. If you criticize Islam, you will get in trouble. All sorts of people are being arrested for various pro-Palestinian expressions of support and so on. And so all of these different issues, which on the face of it have nothing to do with each other, are all finding that their speech is being repressed, because this is the nature of what happens in a fragmented country.
And one group that certainly, I mean, it has an identity, I guess, but it's not a protected identity, is the white working class. Where do they fit into the island of strangers?
I think they are the group of maximum fear for the UK state. both because of their number, but also because they are reviled. There's a line from 1984 I often think of. It's not one of the ones that you hear quoted all the time, and it's, "If there is hope, it lies with the proles," because Winston sees, after I think there's a scuffle in a marketplace, and there's this sudden shocking eruption of violence, and he sees that actually there is this unique power that masses of people possess, and it's the only time in the novel where the security of the state seems very briefly to be in jeopardy. And so I think there's an element of that. There's an element of serious fear about rising civil disorder. We see this in the aftermath of Southport. And there's also this cultural revulsion and disdain. One of the things I'm trying to do in this book is to pick up my own social class and give them a thorough shake and say, look at what you have voted for, look at what is actually going on. And I think that the snobbery that's directed towards the white working class, who do actually have to live with the consequences of what the middle and upper middle class vote for, there is no right of anybody to ignore what white working class people are saying about what's going on in their communities, about the transformations. The grooming gangs, of course, are exhibit A in this story.
And then, of course, they bear the greatest brunt of censorship should they raise those concerns. And what kind of cases have you come across at the FSU, Free Speech Union, that sort of best illustrate your thesis?
Well, one of the most startling findings is that since Keir Starmer was elected in July 2024, we've had a fourfold increase in cases relating to Islam, immigration, and multiculturalism. And so we were set up in 2020 by Toby Young, now Lord Young, and overwhelmingly we were dealing with gender-critical casework. That was about 45% of everything we dealt with. There are still instances of that. There have been some in the press in the last few days, but really we're dealing now primarily with people who have expressed entirely lawful views about immigration, multiculturalism, and Islam. And I think the reason for that, I argue in the book, is that strong societies don't really need censorship. Fragile societies do, and in the wake of the Henry Novak murder and also this attempted beheading in Belfast, which occurred yesterday, we see again and again the same sort of language. There are these appeals not to fuel the far right, not to cause division. And it's this curious term that is bandied around. And again, only on an island of strangers would you need to fear division. And only in those circumstances would that be the first rhetorical tool that political leaders resort to. It's an admission, consciously or not, that Britain is very fragile, that it is an island of strangers, and that even talking about the extent to which our society has profound problems risks exacerbating them, which of course is totally the inverse of what's actually the case.
Yeah. One thinks that division is surely the product of these outrages rather than people acknowledging that they exist.
You can look, for example, at the comments of the Attorney General, Lord Hermer, when he said that effectively people shouldn't say that there's two-tier policing. There is not two-tier policing, and that talking about it reduces trust in institutions. So again, rather than dealing with a problem, the first instinct is to resort to censorship. Again, it's this admission of fragility and this anxiety about social breakdown.
Of course, people who oppose free speech will often say, well, it's freedom for bigots, freedom for the far right, freedom to mouth off and insult people who insult oppressed groups who deserve protection. But isn't there actually a pretty cogent argument to be made that minorities in the UK need free speech, whether that's ethnic minorities, sexual minorities? Do people not need to also be able to express themselves? I'm thinking one example might be an ex-Muslim or something. Those kinds of people are completely not at liberty to speak.
I actually wrote my PhD on the subject of ex-Muslims, and I interviewed 25 former Muslims living in Britain, and I talk in Island of Strangers about one of those stories. I don't give her real name for obvious reasons. When I spoke to her, she was, I think, 18 or 19. I call her Zainab in the book. She was, or is a lesbian. She was found out by her parents, who were very conservative Muslims, and effectively placed under house arrest and locked in her room. The police came around various times. Nothing really was done to resolve it. Eventually, after months of this, she managed to escape, and she went to a women's refuge. And it was at that point that a police officer had a conversation with her, which I will never forget her describing to me, where she said, "I feel like if I talk about what's happened, I'm going to be in danger. People are going to try and hurt me." And his response was, "Well, perhaps it's better not to talk about it."
Wow.
And that, for me, encapsulates the attitude of the UK state, that our problems are so bad, you must not talk about them because it will only make things worse. And they're desperately trying to kick the can down the road to try and eke out a few more years of this sort of experiment. So I'm afraid that's why things are becoming more and more authoritarian. That's why cases like Lucy Connolly are emerging. That's the structural reason for what's going on.
Is there a grain of optimism perhaps to be found in some of that? I mean, free speech is on the political agenda in a way that it hasn't been for years, and that is partly a sad consequence of of the authoritarianism of the current government and of previous governments. But there does feel as if, and I'm sure that the Free Speech Union has contributed this massively, that free speech is a live topic of political debate in the way that it really wasn't 10 years ago. It felt, a bit of a struggle to get people to take free speech issues seriously.
Yeah, totally. In terms of optimism, first of all, although I'm quite gloomy about the structural causes, and I think we need to be honest about what's going on if we're to solve them, the Free Speech Union wins something like 75 to 80% of every case that's brought to us where we're involved from beginning to end. So if you're listening to this and you think you might be in trouble, please contact us at the earliest possible moment. So I don't think people should despair. I just think we need to be quite brutally honest about where we are and why.
And is there, do you think, thinking about, different groups facing censorship for different reasons, is there a possibility, do you think, that people will begin to see that there is a common cause here, that actually free speech is beneficial to all of us, to the whole of society? It's not simply something for academics. It's not an abstract idea. It really matters to people being able to essentially live their lives normally and go about their business.
I hope so, and that's certainly my view. In the book, I talk about what freedom of speech means, and often our conception of it is in terms of talking, to do what we're doing right now, to speak to people and to express your views. But it's also the right to hear other people's views and to hear ideas and to receive information. And it's also the right not to be compelled to say things that you don't believe, things that you don't want to say. And I think it's important to protect all of those elements of freedom of speech. And I think all of them in different ways are under attack because of the conditions that an Island of Strangers creates.
And finally, if you were ever to meet Keir Starmer, and if he's still Prime Minister by the time you do, is there anything in particular that you'd say to him that he has to, what would be the most urgent thing he has to do to reverse this process, to make us a more cohesive society rather than an Island of Strangers?
The frustration is that for a split second, it seemed like perhaps he was starting to understand in a very basic way what the consequences were going to be of his politics, and then he apologized for it. So I'm afraid I think he's beyond hope. I suppose in his defense, I would say one thing, which is that I think any politician of his ilk would also be failing in more or less exactly the same ways. He just happens to have the personal misfortune of being uniquely ill-suited to being Prime Minister.
Fair enough. Well, thank you, Ben Jones. Thank you to everyone at home, and please get a copy of Island of Strangers, which is out now.